So the protests in Iran that began recently are pretty much over now. I think I talked about them when they were going on. In case anyone doesn't remember the situation, they're basically, I believe the government was not raising fuel prices so much as they were cutting the subsidy for fuel in Iran. So basically gas prices were going up. And this led to a lot of protests from people. Apparently, I guess probably to do with the problems with the nuclear program or whatever. Iran needed to get more of their energy from oil, so they couldn't afford to subsidize things as much. And of course, they're having trouble exporting their oil, so this was, progress as far as the U.S. government is concerned, because the strategy of the U.S. over the last few years has been trying to put, I guess most recently renewed under the Trump administration, has been this maximum pressure sanctions campaign. And that is really at the root cause of why the fuel prices had to be raised in Iran. And this is by design. The idea is that they could get the Iranian people to rise up, get mad about these fuel prices, and then they could, that could evolve into a full-scale uprising against the government. And then hopefully, the Ayatollah and the mullahs would be overthrown in favor of some pro-American regime. Now, of course, the mullahs were quite wise to this, and they knew that, and while we don't have confirmation on this, we probably will in a few years, they'd certainly be dumb if they didn't. The CIA, of course, I'm talking about, was probably involved once these fuel protests got off the ground to try and push them, to get them more riled up and to make them into more of a general protest against the government that would lead to regime change. And again, I'm not saying that I'm not doing this to excuse everything that the Iranian government has ever done, to say that, oh, well, the only people who would rise up against them, that's just CIA, provocation. No, what I'm saying is that's the CIA's job. So if you had an opportunity like this to where the protests finally got off the ground, the CIA certainly would be involved trying to make them more extreme and to egg them on and encourage them, whether that's through, helping with organization or funding or things like that. And so realizing this, the Iranian government decided to crack down very heavily, very heavy-handed, very violently against these people who are out protesting. They killed a lot of civilians. There was a lot of, there was blood in the streets. It wasn't a pretty picture, but they were able to put the uprising down. And they seem to have learned from the mistakes of the Shah, who, some people consider, well, I guess most people consider the Shah to have been a very brutal dictator, which he was, but in his final days, when there was an uprising against his rule, people have made the criticism that perhaps he was not brutal enough, if you were looking purely at what he should have done to retain his power, because there was a fear of the Shah for a long time in Iran, and that kept people from rising up. And that's important in an autocratic state, that you have sort of people who fear you, not necessarily people who just respect you and tolerate you. And so once the people lost that fear, they felt it was okay to resist the government. And so what the Shah should have done to make sure that didn't lead to his overthrow was to crack down very violently and show people that they actually should be afraid, that they should not feel like that it's okay for them to go out in the streets and to demonstrate any sort of opposition to the government. And that's exactly what the current Iranian government did here recently. They very quickly had a very swift response to go out there. They're not really doing, say, what the Hong Kong police are, which they're just trying to sort of manage the problem and let the protests go on. What's going on in Hong Kong right now is much more akin to what the Shah did, to where he tried to be a little limp-wristed when it came to his response, so that he wouldn't be called a tyrant. But nevertheless, people still considered him to be a tyrant. And in fact, you could almost argue that by not using enough force, people were more emboldened to call you a terrible person, whereas, if you had scared them a little more, then even if you were acting more tyrannical, people would be less likely to speak out about it. But now that all is said and done and that the uprising has been put down, there is a lot of debate over just how many people were killed, over trying to control the narrative of this whole situation. Now, of course, the official Iranian government line is that, this was all just CIA provocation. There was nothing natural about this at all. No ordinary Iranians wanted to protest anything. And that there were a few CIA agents that might have been killed. But no decent people were harmed in the making of this film. And so that's, basically the Iranian case in a nutshell. Now, the Americans, of course, have a very different interpretation. The American government wants to use this as an effective weapon, this violent crackdown, to bludgeon the Iranian government and make them look bad. So the State Department initially came out and said, oh, well, we've seen reports that there's over 1,000 people who have died. Now, they haven't shown any evidence that there was 1,000 people killed. They haven't cited where these reports are, or who was making these reports, or what their evidence was, and they were just kind of throwing that number out there. And so I was inclined to think, well, that's just kind of a propaganda number, because they're just throwing it out there. It sounds big. Oh, 1,000 people killed. That's like a third of 9/11. And so I didn't necessarily believe that. And then, of course, President Trump came out, and he said, oh, yeah, thousands and thousands of people have been killed in Iran during these protests. These poor freedom fighters, thousands and thousands of them killed. And I pretty much knew immediately that had to be false because, one, Trump exaggerates about everything, and two, that was just a figure that was way over and above even the State Department number. And now finally, today or yesterday, we're getting new reports from anonymous sources, okay? So sources say that 1,500 people were killed in the protests. And now the U.S. government is telling us, oh, well, we've got leakers coming out from inside the Iranian government. And the leakers are telling us that there were 1,500 people dead. Again, we have no evidence to back that up. Just unnamed sources. The same sorts of people who will say, hey, this Trump guy, I saw him at a hotel in Moscow getting peed on by hookers. So forgive me if I'm not willing to take the word of anonymous sources who may not even exist. These could just be people who are made up by the U.S. government. But all this propaganda flying in both directions from both the Iranian side and the American side makes it very difficult to speak honestly about this situation. Because, if you don't really have much of an option other than to buy into the stories of either one of those two governments. So to most people, certainly to the average low IQ binary thinker that exists in the world, the kind of people who watch the news, you either are going to be a shill for the Iranian government or the American government. There's really no in between. Either you accept, oh, thousands and thousands of people were died, which is obviously false, or you think Iran did nothing wrong. The truth really isn't an option in this case. The truth has been completely massacred. We'll probably never know exactly what the full details are, and we won't really have an accurate picture because you have these two regimes fighting over controlling the narrative in world news. Amnesty International has been trying to actually find evidence to document the deaths, and so far they've recorded that there were 304 deaths. Now, there could be more. We don't know, necessarily if there could be 1,000. That seems like a lot more than 304. I mean, that's like triple, and 1,500 is like 5 times as much. So for now, the closest thing to an honest number that we have that isn't just made up and pulled out of thin air is 300, which does not exactly make Iran look good. If in the United States there was some protest movement and the government killed 300 people, I think that'd be a pretty big deal. But here's the problem with the U.S., again, trying to propagandize this and blow up and exaggerate these numbers, is that if in reality Iran killed 300 of its own people in these protests, that's still very bad in and of itself. You don't have to lie and say that it's thousands and thousands, or that it's 1,000 or 1,500. The truth in and of itself is bad enough, but when you decide to lie and make things up, you are essentially giving Iran a free pass, because Iran can just eschew any criticisms and say, oh, you're just being an American shill if you talk about anyone who died in these protests. And, of course, it makes it impossible for me as an American to talk to other people who might have seen on the news that, oh, sources say 1,500 people were killed. And I go, well, no, the number's probably closer to 300. Well, then, of course, they're going to come back at me and say, well, you're just an Iranian shill. What are you speaking Farsi? And this really is what kind of ends up with all political matters, even domestic and international. And I normally think that the foreign policy news is pretty unique and distinct from the domestic politics. But I see the same sort of thing happening in domestic politics. You have it's just like your Democrats and your Republicans. They're both wrong. They're both lying to you. But you have to call them out. You have to call them both out, and that makes it very difficult because if you're calling one out, well, then you obviously are on the side of the other. It makes it difficult for me to call out Obama for increasing spending every year of every one of the 8 years that he was in office, because of course Trump now, the Republican, has also increased spending every year that he's been in office, and we're now spending much more under President Trump, a Republican, the party of trying to economize and roll back government. This is the small government party. We're spending now more than Obama ever did. The party of limited government is presiding over the largest government in human history. Yet if you ask an ordinary American, well, what do you think of when you think of limited government? They'll say Ronald Reagan. Even though Reagan was the man who really started giving us these massive deficits and started us on the road to blowing up this, $23 trillion, whatever it's at now, national debt. Even though Mr. Limited Government never cut spending in any of his 8 years in office. No president ever does. That's just sloganeering. So the overall lesson here is that you can never trust your politicians, you can never trust the news media, and above all, you can never trust the so-called apolitical, unelected bureaucrats in your government. They, in my opinion, are still the worst people among us. It takes extreme vigilance to avoid being shepherded into one of these binary camps on every single issue by the propagandists. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.